thank you for the organisers for inviting me here. Slightly odd to be from the other side of the world to be talking about Gaudi in Barcelona. I do emphasise that you're going to get a very personal view. I was a senior architect on the project from starting in 1979, and my work concluded in 2 or 3 years ago. So my discussion on any aspect of the Sagrada Familia must be seen as purely my own and not representing the organisation in any way. Now, I was intrigued by the invitation and very grateful. And I've actually spent most of my time here judging not the sole judge, on the judging panel for the pavilions. And what an extraordinary collection of work. I've been to every single presentation, so I am absolutely sincere in saying that it's all astonishing work and a great testament to the organisation that you can produce this. Particularly as IASS is a structural engineering, and I'm here as an architect, and my sensibility for that production in the workshop is architecturally focused as much as I'd like to cross-dress. And that's really why I want to talk about Gaudi today in today's context of the challenges that we've had, Bill Baker and Manfred and Philippe have addressed. We've got challenging times ahead. We all know about them. We all know about how well we do with the resources we've got, but we're not sure yet how well we're going to do with less resources and greater demand. And Gaudi is someone who we can look to as someone who seemed to be able to cross all the disciplines better than most. And I'm going to be arguing that teamwork is the major challenge for us ahead of anything else. Discipline expertise is taken, we know it's there, but universally it's very hard to see a fluency across these disciplines. We're a privileged group because we're seeing that fluency in many of the pavilions that are on display and on the keynotes that we've had. So my intrigue is, how does a university help position people who aren't Gaudi? They may have aspirations, and I have to say that anybody involved in the Sagrada Familia would never say that they're walking in Gaudi's shoes. We're simply the people picking up the breadcrumbs that he dropped, and these breadcrumbs will be part of my talk. So I'm going to start by looking at the quintessential Gaudi, why I think he's a model of thinking across many, many disciplines as a sole individual. I'm then going to get quite dry for a bit and just talk about why universities need to change and what I think about that. And then I'm going to move to the Sagrada Familia after Gaudi, just to show you what it means when you have such clear vision. You can die in 1926 and still have a team of people working without any doubt about what their task is. So without further ado, I will start by, for the very few people who haven't been to the Sagrada Familia, I better just show you what the challenge is. And this is the official video of what we're up to. It's about 4 years old now, so it's already historical. But 2026, the anniversary of Gaudi's death, is when the building is due to complete. So these are the sacristies coming up, and that's one here is now completed. And the Tower of Mary, which is the second highest tower on the building, is going to be finished later this year or early next year, I believe. This space is the Sala Croce. I'm going to talk about that in detail, this one here, which not a lot of people know about. The Evangelist Towers are well under construction. The Passion Facade was finished last year, I think. The baptistries are somewhere out there, as is the Glory Facade. My final role in the project was to look at all the evidence from Gaudi about what is intended for that facade. Evangelist Towers, and then the main tower to Jesus Christ, 172.5 metres tall, will make this the highest religious building in the world. So that's the challenge. And when I showed this 4 years ago, which is when I think it came out, people would say 2026, come on, you're in your dreams. But I think you'll see when you go there just how much has happened. The main part of the building is now at the same height, more or less, as the existing part, something that many of us didn't think we'd see in our lifetime. The position of the building, of course, it was founded by a committee of concerned citizens who felt that the growing Barcelona outside the Gothic quarter was being socially challenged through the sudden creation of wealth and the working classes that come with it, and felt that a church dedicated to the Holy Family, the Sagrada Familia, would be in order. And it was originally being built in fields, but as you can see now, it's very well integrated inside the fabric of the city. And in Gaudi's time, he managed to finish just one tower. The four towers were completed, but he only saw the one tower when he was tragically struck by a tram. And he had also built most of the apse. But that's only less than 10% of the building. And of course, a very interesting problem. When I first found the building, I came because I, as a student at the University of Cambridge in the UK, had been advised that Gaudi had no school. We looked at him in one or two slides. He was described as possibly a genius, probably mad, but there was no school, meaning that he had nothing to offer us. So as students in the late modern movement education that we were receiving in the 1970s, nothing to see, move along. But of course, coming from the Antipodes, that's a red light, which means a green light. So I was in Barcelona as quickly as possible, and was a bit phased because I came out of the metro and found myself looking at this facade, which is not what I was expecting. I understood that there were four towers and a part of an apse, and it was a sort of testament of a failed genius. And there I was looking at a crane and a building that was manifestly under construction. And this led to an interview with the two directors, both of whom are 90 years old at the time, who were looking to start the major thinking for the body of the building, the nave. And the questions I had for them was, where was their authority coming from? Because I'd heard about the drawings being burnt. And the second question was, and even if you had authority, how on earth do you communicate to the builders what the process is? And they said, well, that's a good time to be asking these questions because we're looking for someone to help us on this. And it was a kind of one of those very unexpected offers. I have to be honest and say that I didn't take it up. I was going back to be a great modernist architect myself and went back to finish my studies. But naturally, you can imagine, I reflected on that decision and wrote back, and was fortunately given a chance to go. I went there, and that started the journey of unravelling the secrets of Gaudi's method that has allowed us to continue on. I'm only going to show those methods briefly, but because you're all engineers and mostly extremely clever, so you don't need to wear it out like I would if it was a room full of architects. But there is a fact that these two 90-year-olds had worked with Gaudi and as students of architecture in his final years. He would give lectures on his latest discoveries on site, and they in turn would help to push for finding funds for the building. Because as you, I hope, are aware, this is a crowd-sourced building. Has been from the beginning. It's never been funded centrally or from the government. It's actually been funded for and by the people, and which is an important fact, because I reflect on every city the size of Barcelona around the world could have been doing something like this. It didn't need to be a church necessarily. It could have been a museum or a cultural institution. But Barcelona, I think, is the only city I know in anywhere that has this resilience to put a building up as a proposal, and then through civil war and through economic cycles still plug away at it. And here I am talking about it. Gaudi conceived it it wasn't his building. He inherited the plan from another architect, and it was well underway, so he didn't have much option then to stick to the Gothic Revival plan. But he did have options as the years rolled by. He worked on it for 43 years to make a statement about the limitations of Gothic architecture and how, with certain insights, these could be improved upon. So he saw starting with narrative, he saw this as a forest, an urban forest that you'd walk into, and these columns would draw you up to the heavens. And that's exactly what it feels like. What I love about the building is it makes fantastic photographs. You don't have to be an expert. You just point the camera and a great photograph comes out. But I'm hoping there are people who are in the room who haven't been there yet, and I can tell you that the photographs don't prepare you for it in any way, and I'm sure people who have been to it and look at these photographs know what I mean. Those photographs are inspiring, but it's actually a completely weird experience of space and light. You're also going to be surprised because these photographs here show it as being a very white light. It was originally glazed temporarily in clear glass, and then became slowly the stained glass has been added to it. So this is not what you'll see if you haven't been there before. Also, you'll see it with considerably bigger crowds. These aren't trick photographs. It was literally not as visited then, especially on the opening. This is the inauguration with the Pope on November the 7th in 2010. So that effectively was the completion of the building in many ways. That's when you could go through the door and see the interior. And the rest is the main facade and the towers, which don't really affect the experience of the interior. There we have the former Pope, Benedict XVI, doing his thing. And now you can start seeing what the coloured light does for the building. It's very, very different. Gaudi never wrote a word on his theory, but he spoke a lot. Hence, the young architects who were then my senior colleagues had made notes, and the notes are very consistent. And they're in a book called Gaudi's Thoughts, they're collected. And he talked specifically about having coloured light around the bottom of the building and clear light around the top. So you get this extraordinary effect of heavenly clear light at the top of the building and this awesome light. And the other thing that's very clever about this stained glass, it means that the building is different at different times of the day, different weather and different seasons. So you cannot go to the Sagrada Familia and tick it off your list. You'll just have to come back another time in another season. And there you can see this effect of the white light above and the coloured glass. Blues and greens on the east side, cool, natural, and then the fiery reds on the setting sun. Now, there's some funny things about the building. So if there's one thing that's unique about me, it's the fact that I think I'm the only person who's worked on the building digitally and pre-digitally. I did all the hard yards by hand and by calculator and by slide rule, would you believe? And the building represents all sorts of milestones. When I lectured about it in the 1990s and showed everybody what we were doing with very advanced software, I would get, that's all very interesting, but what's this got to do with me? And I was saying, well, that's what I'm trying to show you. I was explaining what I thought would be the world of architecture in 5 years' time. In fact, it's taken between 15 and 20 years for the rest of the world to catch up with the techniques that we've been using on this project. Starting with robot stone cutting, that's 1989. Parametric design, where we're using aeronautical software in 1992. 3D printing, I think this will be the first project to have had models made of it using 3D printing, because the machine that first brought them out was very pleased to have this building as a chance to strut its stuff. LiDAR scanning, we didn't get a LiDAR scanner. We got one of the first ones that came out, but that was in 2007, I think. So it's taken a long time before we could actually scan the building in order to actually embrace the computer power and the 3D printing to have a model. So most of my work and the team's work have been without the whole model as a reference, which is very odd when you think about it. So when I show you this part here, which is I'm going to talk about this space here, we had to design this without ever being able to see it located in a 3D model, because we simply didn't print it until 2012. Now, because the engineering, I thought I'd better put some structures in, even though I have no pretensions in this. I did talk about, the title was Gaudi, Structural Artist, and this is in reference to David Billington and Candela Isla, Maya. We've seen at least 2 slides. I was going to put one up just to be naughty. Nervi Dieste. These are great engineers with architectural sensibility who met the target of efficiency, economy, and elegance, also in a scientific, social, and symbolic context. So these are great art engineers who showed architectural sensibility, and I want to show Gaudi as an architect with engineering sensibility. Probably more than that, I'd want to show him as an engineer, because as far as I know, he did all his own calculations, so presumably that qualifies him. This is the Gothic Revival project that he first put to the client. It took him about 20 years before the client ever saw a drawing of what the building might look like, by the way, so there's a lot of trust. And eventually this is a series of models by David Putsch, who's one of the lead architects at Sagrada Familia today. His PhD was looking at the evolution of Gaudi's work. So this is the first neo-Gothic solution, which you can see not a lot of surprises. And this is actually the second, but not the final version. But you can see that he's assimilated something in terms of his structure. It's called the parabolic version because it's literally taking the parabola, which is an approximation of the catenary, as the structural system. And then, just for, I hope you can see this is a book published by Pucci Boada, who was one of the 2 architects who first employed me in his 90, but in 1929 he produced this book on the Sagrada Familia, including the static resolution for the building, which, as far as I'm aware, when finite element analysis was employed many decades later, led to no change whatsoever in what Gaudi had designed. You can see it's all fair dinkum, as we say in Australia. It doesn't mean a lot to me, but it meant a lot to Gaudi, and everybody's built on the basis of this. So, just the first myth, the building was not designed with a hanging model in any way, but he drew from what he'd been doing at the Colonia Well Church, which I'm going to talk about briefly, and made a static version of the calculation of it. I'm going to talk a little bit about things that didn't go completely according to plan. And that's a bit of a silly euphemism, because I don't think Gaudi worked to plan. He's a volumetric kind of person. But this is the drawing of he had for the Casa Mila La Pedrera apartments, and this was actually what's built. And you'll see that there's a big difference. This great sculpture of the angels by Carlos Mani was never built, because the client at one point, due to social unrest and around a religious sort of reaction to the church, decided that he wanted to know none of none of Gaudi's faith worn out on the building. So the building was quite a disappointing building from everybody's point of view. Gaudi, because it was stripped of all its religious voice. The client, because it cost many times over budget. It took many times longer to build than was expected. He was using his wife's money to speculate on a prime piece of real estate, wanting some apartments that would shift and make a good profit. And the famous exchange, if you're teaching client relationships at a school of architecture, it's a great example of what not to do, because when the client's wife, whose money was being invested in this, asked, having seen the plans for the first time, where was she going to put a grand piano, he suggested that she took up the violin. Why? Because this was actually what was proposed. This is one of the floor plans, and this is the upper plans. They're all flats. But if you actually look at what was built, you can see that Gaudi himself had to enter what Greg Lynn called contractor space. And contractor space is when all the dreams of the architect and the engineer are reduced to straight lines, because that's what they understand best. And this is where you can see that if you were putting a grand piano in here, and this, the joke, of course, is for architects, anybody younger than, I don't know, generation behind will have no idea what I'm talking about, but people trained in my generation worked with stencils. And the stencils would have dining table and chairs and a kitchen bench. And for some reason that nobody ever knew, a grand piano was always on the stencil. Anyway, we can play the grand piano here. So these are Gaudi's drawings. And we don't really fully appreciate that it's actually a steel building built by shipbuilders were the engineers and makers of the frame. So a very early example of a steel building. So what we're looking at is a stone veneer. And because it's so perfect, we don't actually look at it critically enough and imagine how on earth did these blocks of such weight get built, 5-6 stories above the street level and fit so perfectly. And what about the kind of radical idea of a crease that becomes smoothed out? It's a long time now, but every time I had a chance to get students to model this by hand, they could do it with sandpaper on a piece of square section timber and they could just roll it. Then I'd ask them to model it on a computer, and it's probably a bit easier now, but certainly it was impossible to get that fluency that you can in the real world. And the building, when it was finished, had fallen out of fashion. So not only did it cost so much, take so long to build, but it was now a joke. Here it's being Witt is proposing it as an airship station. And but worse than that was Gaudi himself fell out with the client, and I'll leave you to go on. He fell out with the client, and you can see them having a battle because, in fact, it led to a court case where Gaudi was actually claiming his fee. A little bit of theory for today. Towards a plastic architecture. The new architecture is open. The whole structure consists of a space that is divided in accordance with the various functional demands. This division is carried out by means of dividing surfaces in the interior or protective surfaces externally. The former, which separate the various functional spaces, may be movable. That is to say, the dividing surfaces, formerly the interior walls, may be replaced by movable intermediate surfaces or panels. The same method may be employed for doors. In architecture's next phase of development, the ground plan must disappear completely. The two-dimensional spatial composition fixed in a ground plan will be replaced by an exact constructional calculation, a calculation by means of which the supporting capacity is restricted to the simplest but strongest supporting points. We've seen a lot of that over the last few days. For this purpose, Euclidean mathematics will be of no further use. But with the aid of calculation that is non-Euclidean and takes into account the 4 dimensions, everything will be very easy. Well, the whole point of this conference is to drill home that it's not very easy and that we're all incredibly clever by finding our workarounds. But isn't it incredible? This was written in 1924, 2 years before Gaudi died, by Theo van Doesburg, Towards a Plastic Architecture. He's making a manifesto case for why we need to take ourselves out of the rectilinear and out of the Euclidean, and Gaudi was doing just that. We can see that very clearly in this building, which I know you know very well, but I'm going to share you my thoughts about it, which is the Colonia Güell Chapel Crypt by Antoni Gaudi. You can see that it was a long project. It was 1896 to 1914, starting with the famous hanging model, which I won't dwell on too much, but did you know that it had tensometers, that it was highly scientific? So back to the Billington scientific, social and symbolic, this is scientific. Not only did he make the world's first, I'm sort of doing a bit Trumpian there, should we say, one of the world's first architectural computers, but I'd love to know if there was any earlier. Force finding form, the theme of this conference. Obviously this building is the primary exemplar of this. But Gaudi, it took 8 years to do this, and he was building it off-site in a shed, off-site Barcelona, on-site outside Barcelona, in a shed at a scale of 1 to 10, and obviously modelling all the weights very accurately at a scale of 1 to 10,000. And the gravity was finding the building, force of the building, and the tensometers, which he placed in various strategic places, were measuring the forces, and he would then mark them on these little discs. And then the model was painstakingly rebuilt by Jos Tomlof and colleagues, ultimately in Fry Otto's Institute of Lightweight Structures. So by having Jos and team rebuild it, we know exactly what was involved. It took 8 years, and then it took another, imagine this is an undrawable project. So this was what Gaudi did. He actually had to take a photograph of the building, turn it upside down, paint over it, and that's what the client was presented with after 8 years. And when he asked what it looked like inside, no problem, it's another photograph and painted. So these are all pre-digital techniques when you think about it. It's Photoshop, it's Maya, and then you comes to the parametric modeling. The model itself was parametric, obviously, and it was used as the drawing for the project. All the measurements were taken at a scaled up and put on site, and then you get this extraordinary interior. So those of you who are here long enough to go out here and haven't been here, it's an extraordinary project. I think it's Gaudi's his best project, but not his most important. It's his best project because it working as an artist and as a sculptor, he took it as far as he could, and he didn't take it far enough, as you'll see from the outside. It only was constructed to the basement. The whole church above was never constructed, and no doubt never will be. So he had a great client that would allow him 6 years to do this. There's no steel, there's no tricks, there's no concrete. It's all Catalan vaulting, which you've heard about from several sources, and just very skillful brickwork. And someone with a lot of confidence, because he decided that these basalt columns, which were part of the natural that's come out of the ground as hexagonal prisms, were a bit overstructured. So he asked the stonemasons to chip away each one. You can see there's a layer of lead here. He's even thought about that. There's 2 centimetres of lead so that the building can just adjust as it gets higher. And in order to gain the confidence of the stonemasons to make this scarf cut, he had to stand underneath it while he was doing it. Oh. So I think that's someone who knew his stuff. In this project, he introduced the hyperbolic paraboloid for the first time, a ruled surface, and you can see that appearing. It seems decorative here, but you'll find, and here, it's a decoratively applied surface, but it has great meaning for the rest of us who followed in his footsteps. In terms of sustainability, can't get more sustainable than this. This is brick, not of the first quality, which are actually placed along the lines of force. And anywhere where there's infill, he's using the brick. That's the broken brick that comes out of a misfiring. You know, when they make bricks, there's always some that aren't up to scratch. Well, that's what he did with them there. And then with these windows, which are to die for, because they're like butterfly wings that open, the grills are made from the discarded needles from the factory that this little chapel was to support. It was a corduroy factory. So Gaudi, in the beginning of the 20th century, was looking at sustainability in no uncertain terms. Testaments of failed genius, these have been now cleaned up by UNESCO and whisked away, but it was such a romantic building to go to until it got at by it's been restored, but it was better when it was the way it was, in my opinion. And you had these columns just waiting sadly outside for the interior that they'd never be asked to involve themselves with. So let's have a look at other aspects of Gaudi. I'm going to talk about columns shortly, in his generation of columns, but even in one of his early works, which was finished in 1889, which is the Palau Güell, the bottom of the Ramblas, it was for his major client, who was also Park Güell and the Colonia Güell, Count Güell, and no expense was spared. It's a great building to visit. It's very easy. It's right in the centre of town, and you can see the most extraordinary materials, ivory, ebony, in profusion, being used in the most extraordinary way. Not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about this, which is a very hard building to visit. but certainly one of my favourites. It was finished exactly the same year as this opulent town palace for Count Guay. It's just a giant shoebox, which is a school for the Teresian nuns just outside the centre of Barcelona. It used to be only visitable on Saturday mornings, but I haven't been for years, which is why I've had to plunder historic books. But that's what it looked like when it was finished. And this is the plan of it. This is the floor plan. These are referring to arches. So this is ground floor. The next one up has these arches, which is like an arcade of parabolic arches which go the whole length, which I'm sure you've seen. That's them here, full length of the building. It's only got three materials. It's brick, random rubble, and plaster. That's it, entire thing. Yet, look at these columns. These columns are located in section here on this floor. So they're supporting 2 floors of masonry above them. And to architecture students, I always ask them to go away and think about why these columns manage to do the job they do. In the hall that they're in, because it's in a hall that goes to a third of the width of the building, you can put your ear to one column in the one corner and ask somebody literally just to tap, just no more than that, the column diametrically opposite, and you can hear it twanging away like a musical instrument. They're working very hard, but when you think about why they don't collapse, it's very clever. It's that business we just heard. You've got loaded, from the previous talk, if you load structure up, it actually can perform better than if it isn't. They're not going to shear very easily because it's got 2 floors of masonry. They're not going to buckle very easily because you're going to have to actually tip 2 floors of masonry up. So that's why they're still there. These columns are actually conduits in Park Güell that taking water down from the terrace above. These columns look arbitrary, but they're not. They're absolutely calculated to be as retaining walls. Playfulness and creativity are the 2 ingredients that a structural artist and therefore the architectural artist has to bring. And here's Gaudi. I mean, that's as playful as it gets, referring to the Erechtheum in the Parthenon. And of course, you've seen this. What did he do to make sure that the building could be continued in his absence? Because indeed he must have realised when he was aged 62 that he had the Casamila sort of catastrophe. When I ask people what is Park Güell, most people don't seem to realise that it's actually a failed gated community. It was meant to have 60 houses in it, but all the investment went into the infrastructure. So it's a great park, but not a very good housing estate. It's only got 2 houses in it. Obviously, with the Sagrada Familia not looking very flush in terms of progress, he was ill, he was convalescing in the Pyrenees, and he must have been wondering what the plan would be after his demise. And so he thought about bringing a geometry to bear, which is doubly ruled surfaces. There are only 3: planes, hyperboloids of revolution, and hyperbolic paraboloids. Why? Because these surfaces are very easy to describe. They're, as you can see, straight lines in space. And that means if you've got straight lines in space, anybody making one can be just pointed to where a line starts and finishes, whether they're cutting or laying down. It's a superb. But on top of that, it means that the lines of force are going along the surface, so you can lay reinforcement if you need to. And light, as he describes it in Catalan, lliscar, glides across the surface. So light will glide through these. And also we found latterly that he treated the surfaces as very likely to be acoustically beneficial. He left prototypes. This is the sacristy, which was reduced to rubble with all the remaining models. The answer to my questions when I asked the 2 directors where the work was going was that he had a system. You'll find all the answers in the models. So the authority was not the drawings, which were burnt in the Civil War, because I think they were mostly templates, in my view. But the models were smashed. But they weren't ground to dust, which is fortunate. So with just a few pieces, and the fact that there's a system, I'm not going to explain the system, I'm just going to show you that there is a system, and there's there's plenty of writing about it now. But just these small amount of fragments allowed us to take an archaeological standpoint and distill the surfaces from that. And these are a range of two hyperbolic paraboloids, a green one and a red one. They intersect, and there you have the generation of the roof of the sacristy. But not only that, this is a parametrically variable entity. All the towers, remaining towers for the building, other than the ones in the perimeter, are based on this construct. And not sure why he did this, but he did literally a tracing in limestone that survived the fire. It's so fine, it's about this wide. We've measured it accurately. These are the sections through the parabolas. It's not like it looks like it's a whole bunch of intersecting hyperbolic paraboloids. It is a selection of hyperbolic paraboloids. Everything right down to the decoration is based on these doubly ruled surfaces. Here you can see the primary intersections for the ceiling vaults of hyperboloids, a revolution of one sheet. And there's the proof. It's not that it looks like a hyperboloid revolution, it is a hyperboloid revolution, which means with just a few fragments we've been able to extract the geometry from the project and then use appropriate technology to build it. The story of the column generation can be shown in in this video here. So, what's the story about these columns? What is it about a systematic algorithmic approach to architecture that Gaudi spent his last 12 years on that allows these columns to be built years after he died? They're based on a section through a hyperbolic paraboloid, which is a parabola. So we've got convex and concave parabolas forming a profile around the perimeter. So all of the columns at ground level have this as their basis. Cotangent, convex, concave parabolas, which in extrusion would give you a barley sugar or singly rotated. But in fact, the column profile is two profiles sitting on top of each other. And these two profiles are wandering from each other as the column gets higher. So you're seeing it in 2D to make it really difficult to understand what I'm talking about. But that's so that when you see it in 3D, it all becomes clear and you realize it's not 3D at all, it's 4D. That Gaudi is thinking in non-Euclidean 4D way. So that's what the column looks like, and we'll now see it going up. So you can see as it rises, those two profiles are counter-rotating, and you can see the column emerging. When it gets to a certain height, if it carried on going, it would just go back on itself. So brilliantly, he then, following nature's guide, he doubles them. So at this point here, you can see the two profiles are exactly out of phase. It cannot continue. So what he does, he doubles the profiles, and that gives you the next series going up. And again, so when you look at the column and its final generation, so all the columns you're looking at have this double counter-rotation behind them. So here you can see the arises appearing, and when it gets exactly half out of phase, it doubles the profiles and you get a new set of arises coming. And then here's the beauty of it. You don't need a robot to make it. So that's the technique for making the columns, if you were describing them. Obviously, you have to do it in sections, so when you have the doubling, you get it. But superbly simple technique. And so when I'm talking to my students about what is an idea and what is a concept, and does it have to be complicated? I show them that complexity, real engaging complexity, can come from the most simple gestures, and we all know that. Gaudi was king of it. So I've got 8 minutes left. I'm going to do some very dry stuff and then just finish with a bang by showing you how the building's being built today. The dry stuff is important, I think, which is why I'm showing it. It's this difficult nexus between research institutions, universities and practice. And I thought this was a peculiar Australian condition, but I think it's actually fairly typical, which is how do you get a recipe for universities, practice and research to work together with synergy? Well, it's indulgent clients and no real hurry. Well, Gaudi had those, but we typically don't. Governments who believe in tax-funded research for public good, well, that varies across the world, but it's not too evident in where I live. Practices willing to share their knowledge. Now, that's a good one, isn't it? A lot of changes required there. Universities able to work with real-world constraints and postgraduate students willing to extend their architectural education by a number of years. Yet we need this to happen, for research to happen. And the Sagrada Familia, of course, has been just that. That's why it's been such an important building to talk about. As much to celebrate the genius of Gaudi, but to celebrate what it means to have a project like this, a living laboratory for experimentation, because it's also certainly the most advanced building in terms of off-site fabrication, which I'll show you briefly in a minute. Because, why is it the most complicated? Because it's being built with people going through the building. There may be other complicated buildings going up, but they're not being visited by 4 million people annually. So the amazing thing we've got to do is embrace the tame problem solvers. A lot of engineers are definitely equipped with this skill. They can take a problem and find a straighter path possible to the answer. Whereas architects and designers tend to embrace the wicked problem as their ideal environment, where a lot of questions will be strung up along the way. There will be something at the end, but it will be an option, not the answer. It'll be the best option if we've done a good job. But when you see how this comes together, this is 8 institutions with their various design skills being mapped so that we could do a major Australia-European funding grant. And you just realise that all design, for instance, there's just so much that's in design. And yet, in this kind of conceit that architects have, we typically split our courses up into usually 6 specialist subjects with some kind of design overlay. Design could be at the core of it, or it could be a loose mix, or it could be represented specifically in them. Whereas for years now, we've had this opportunity to have a kind of digital overlay, which allows us to effortlessly talk the same language, whether it's historical, whether it's technological, whether it's economic, philosophical. We have these incredible tools now to do this. But how many schools of architecture, I'm not sure that engineering is far behind, or better, are really making the most of this? And how many universities are able to get these silos to really get across? Have we really got to the bottom of what is the proper and most appropriate disciplinary conversation? We argue that the transdisciplinary is the way to go. Transdisciplinary project, typically at least 2 disciplines working on a project, not just in the library, with an external partner. And so the university I'm at, Swinburne University of Technology, all our research has to have an external partner, otherwise it's just not embraced as being reasonable. We also have the need to get the Boyer Scholarship Triangle kicking in, and that's what I love about the old architects seeing Gaudi when they were just sort of young architects, but there was an eminent scholar, Gaudi himself. But universities have these pillars, but they sit in faculties and may or may not talk to each other within the faculty, but then to get the faculties to cross each other, very, very hard. What it represents, though, when you see it, is this is a mapping of a university ranging from art to hard technology or senior experience to novice. There's pockets of activity and opportunities for clusters to form where we can really have a very good time. And then when you remap the university, you can see if you get all this to happen, it's a very rich environment that nowhere else can compete with. There's no possibility of a large accountancy firm or a large engineering company or multidisciplinary to be able to say they can do this. So that's my beef. But this is the problem. And if we're going to do transdisciplinary, let's say we're going to have 30 students in a studio, 15 engineers and 50 architects, that's going to be 2 teachers. Because how many teachers do we have who are able to do both? How many Gaudis are there who can come and do that? So I think the major role for us all as educators is to produce the people who can approximate Gaudi as much as possible, and that's by getting students to work together and trade off their various skills. So to finish off, I'll just show you the Sala Kraue. I am having difficulty finding it. So, big ambitions. This is published during Gaudi's time in the album that used to come out from time to time, talking about where the project could go. There's the Sagrada Familia, there's St. Peter's, and there's St. Mark's in Venice. So big ambitions. What do we take from this drawing? He has produced this in his lifetime. It was published, so we know that he had a very clear sense of the interior. What do we make of this space here? So from my point of view, as an architect on the project, I had at least 2 decades of apprenticeship because I was just reverse engineering some existing models. But when we came to this point, it was gloves off. We had to extrapolate the lessons of the apprenticeship to something else. So we had a debate about, is it hatched out because it was no relevance to Gaudi, that it was just an attic space, or is it hatched out because it's going to be the last thing to be built and he didn't want to invest time on it? Every attic space in Gaudi, this is Belles Guard, just a private house in Barcelona, and you look at the brickwork for this, which architect's going to do this for an attic of a house and not think big for the attic of a basilica? This is Casa Mila, the same thing. This is the famous catenary chains that were used to find the forms for these ribs. So we decided to make this into an auditorium because it's the space where everybody will collect at the end of the ascent past the nave and before going up to the tower right above it. So it's about 72 meters above the center of the building. And we decided to make it into a sort of floating flying saucer so that light will be able to go into it and light will be able to go below it. And the story of its production is a great one. This is Carlos Boucheret, one of the engineers. We work as a family. There's no sort of going down to somebody else's offices. This is in the basement model workshop at the Sagrada Familia, where we're happy to use materials, whether they're 3D printed or hand-built or provisional, happy to use digital projection, discussing whether or not those 4 columns in the center were required to help support the core of the main tower. We're using this parametric software, so for the first time, as far as I'm aware, on a major architectural project, we are using aeronautical software with teams, each with different components. We're able to, with the emergence of the 3D printing, do 3 1:25 prints in 1:100, I think it was, sorry, in 1 week. We were able to do things that Gaudi couldn't do, like a curved window, because of his technique of making models relied on a flat plane. And so the project emerged. But what we couldn't do was do any faithful renders of what the space might look like inside. You can see the renderer, Australia's top, is able to do exquisite rendering for everything that's known, like the metal and the glass. But we, calculating the light levels in there, in the end, it had to be done through trusting one's own instincts. And then the fabrication, this is coincided with the time when all fabrication for the building was made off-site. So no stonework was being laid at the Sagrada Familia for about 15 years now. It's all been done off-site. You can see the emergence of it, a mixture of precast and in situ. I'm over time now, and just with the crescendo. You can see it emerging. It's at the moment it's not any further ahead than it is in these shots, which are 2 years ago. But you can see plenty of light, big relief when the scaffolding came down, because it took about eight years to build, and was it going to be light enough? And it's plenty light enough. And I know it's lunchtime, but I just want to show you one last set of slides to show you it's not all about technology. So just to summarise it all, the power of the idea, Gaudi, branching in the Sagrada Familia. This branch here, same technique. It's I'd love to give you 2 minutes to think about how do you generate that particular column, but I'll save you the problem by just saying it's a rectangle. It's a counter-rotating rectangle. And who would have thought that that shape would emerge from such a simple technique? And it's analog. And for many years now, I have been running with Rodrigo Aguirre at the IAC School of Architecture, one of the most progressive schools of architecture in the world. That's Jordi Fauli, who's the current architect director of the Sagrada Familia. We run a branching workshop. They work in analog making the columns, and they work digitally to do the branching. And it's coinciding with great inventions in 3D printing of concrete, so that we will be able to start working as expressively as this. So that's the legacy of Gaudi, that's the legacy of the Sagrada Familia for Barcelona, and thank you for your time.